ladies and gentlemen. Hope everybody's got a seat. Looks like it. We've got plenty left. On behalf of Stellenbosch University International, a very, very warm welcome to the annual African University Day celebrations. I also would like to say a special welcome, especially to our students. I see a couple of familiar faces, and I hope that you're all done with exams. And if you've submitted, that we will be able to sing Gaudiamus at the graduation ceremony with you. And also to our colleagues. And then again, a very special welcome to our guests. And they, I would like to introduce by name later on in more detail. So at this stage, Dr. Nyambura Mwagiru, Farai Mubaiwa, Edith Beckman, and our facilitator, Mohini Catelli. And I think a special mention to Farai, who is celebrating her birthday with us. So, will you please join me in singing happy birthday? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Farai. Happy birthday to you. I have never felt so nervous to sing happy birthday. Very, very welcome. For those of you who don't know me and who can't see me behind the podium wearing flats today, I'm Heidi October. I'm the Deputy Director at the Center for Student Leadership and Structures and also the head of the Frederick van Zyl Leadership Institute. I'm very honored today to have been invited to celebrate this day with you, but also to join you in reflecting. The theme that says this year we are celebrating the Africa we want. We're contemplating the Africa we want and the role of young people. So this year we would like to explore together the critical role the youth need to play in influencing policy, legislative and social change, and constructively disrupting the status quo. And perhaps also taking a more active role in ensuring that we attain the Africa that we want by the year 2065. So to quote the Secretary General of the AAU, Professor Etienne Hille, putting the youth at the forefront of Africa's transformation agenda seems like the right thing to do. That goes without saying, and yet it does not go without saying. Hashtag I am African. So that was associated with the international call to all students on the African continent to wear something that would celebrate Africa on the 15th of November 2018. And I've contemplated a little bit about this. And while I'm very conscious of the complexities of cultural appropriation, by wearing a typical Berber handmade attire, I also wanted to acknowledge the country, Morocco, where on the 12th of November 1967 in Rabat, the Association of the African Universities was created by African universities. And maybe we should pause here for a while and reflect why today, 51 years later, it was necessary to start this organization. So when I did my homework, it was very clear that the vision of the AAU is simple: to be the leading advocate for the African higher education on the continent, but with the main purpose of supporting African universities to improve the quality of African higher education. Currently, the AAU Secretariat is hosted by the government of Ghana in Accra. So a little bit more about the history of the week that we're celebrating. It was first launched in 2005 in Ghana, later following celebrations all over Africa through a week of innovative celebratory activities ranging from topical seminars, which I'm really excited to hear more about today, debates on African higher education, exhibitions and social media conversations among African academics, including our students. And here at Stellenbosch University, we had our first annual celebration 7 years ago. So the purpose is really twofold. On the one hand, focusing the attention on somewhat the perhaps unique challenges we are facing within African higher ed space, but also to reflect the progress that we've made over the last 51 years, opportunities that also emerge through those challenges and by creating platforms like we've created today. And then secondly, to aim to attract human resources, financial resources, but to organize more networking opportunities and advocacy for the AAU by our youth. So now, moving from the what and the why we are here today, I think the most logical next question would be, now how do we do it together? So the association continues on the African continent to engage a diversity of stakeholders, and it's quite interesting for me that a lot of African student unions are involved in celebrating the African University Day, ranging from national councils of higher education, ministries of education, several development partners within the corporate sector. And also, interesting to know, it includes a committee of 10 heads of states that were nominated to champion African higher education. So the what, the why, and the how, which brings me a little closer to home. And the final, I think, contextualized question I had to ask myself last night when I reflected about my role as a South African woman, but also being employed at a university, Stellenbosch University on the African continent, which is still perceived as a privileged environment. So what are we doing collectively on our campus? And here I would like to highlight a few examples. Our Stellenbosch University International Office has renewed its vision and strategy with a dedicated focus to expand our African partnerships with more academic and cultural opportunities on our continent and an increase in students from all over Africa. Secondly, collaborative research, supervision, and exchange are also encouraged through the Partnership for Africa's Next Generation of Academics. That's a mouthful. The shorter version for that is Pangaea, involving leading universities across Africa. And this also is supported through our prestigious African Doctoral Academy within the Africa Center for Scholarship. What excited me most about what I wanted to share with you today, because I think it's also inspiring for those of us who are still aspiring to do our PhDs, is the following statistics that I'd like to share with you. More than 200 doctoral scholars from 18 African countries, including South Africa, have enrolled in this scholarship program since the year 2010. And a total of 114 have successfully graduated, of which 83% completed it in 3 years or less. 83% completed it in 3 years or less. So I guess it can be done. It seems impossible until, well, it's done. So apart from our annual Africa Day celebrations, our international students are actively contributing in a transformative student experience, something that we would like to be part of our Vision 2040 as a partner, African partner university on our continent. And the way our international students are changing our student experience is through sharing their knowledge of their countries, their customs, their cultures, and also by challenging our South African students to think and unthink and unlearn what we've been taught for many, many years. So within the co-curriculum spaces and the curriculum spaces within the living and learning and leadership spaces, I am very excited to have been observing the amount and continuous amount of international students participating and contributing to that change. Lastly, within our leadership space, our students question our curriculum, our understanding of leadership, And to give you an example, through our African Leadership Development Program, it's an online program, one of our online programs at the FEZS. We explore our understanding of African identity and encouraging our participants across the continent and our African partners across the continent to explore what African leadership is all about. And what was interesting for me when I joined earlier this year, when I joined Stellenbosch University earlier this year, was the realization that that particular program was created because students identified the need. And that student-driven organization was Africa Matters, which I'm sure Farai would also mention. So this brings me to the last point I'd like to make before I introduce our first guest speaker. When I reflected on the relevance 51 years later of why we should continue to celebrate the differences of an African higher education space versus a higher education space in general, I think for me the question is more around, if we say we want to invest in the future, then there is a realization that we are waiting for people to be that change. And a phrase that we're continuously seeing within social media is that we, the people in this room, are the people that we've been waiting for. So let that just be a reminder for all of us as we continue to celebrate our African heritage. Thank you. This brings me to the reason why we're all here today. I'd like to introduce our first guest speaker, Dr. Nyambura Mwagiru. And I said to her when I met her earlier today that I was very excited to meet her because she is busy with incredibly interesting research. She's currently International Affairs Coordinator, customized academic programs at the Stellenbosch University Business School, USB, at their international office. She holds a BA Honours in Political Science and Conflict Resolution, an MA in International Relations, LLM in Tax Law, and a PhD in Business Administration at UCT. So, being an alumna of Landeck International University, Switzerland, WIT, UCT, and now joining Stellenbosch University, I'm sure that you're bringing a range of insight into the different spaces in higher ed within South Africa, but also from the international perspective. Currently, her research interests are internationalization of higher education, the role of institutional dialogue processes in peace building and corporate social responsibility, sustainable futures, impacts of tax law and fiscal policy, and she is also the co-founder and communications and public officer in Saison's a research and multi-sector business organization which focuses on capacity building for executive management, institutional development, and policy dialogues with local, regional, and international organizations. So as a governance specialist, she is very much interested to also reflect how we can approach leadership differently in South Africa and on our continent in general. She's a trained mediator, and through her previous engagements as program officer with the International Education for Peace Institute in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and also as a UCT acting manager within the governance space, I think she is more than equipped and empowered to share with us her insights today. I do welcome you. Thank you.
Right, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. I hope you're all well. Thank you so much for coming today, and thank you very much to the Center for Collaboration in Africa, to Norma and to Nico Cloutier for the invitation, and thank you very much to Heidi for the wonderful introduction. It really is a pleasure for me to be here with you today and to celebrate this Africa University Day. As Heidi shared, I am and continue to be an international student and a lifelong learner. And when we received the invitation for the presentation today, we were asked to look at or to choose one of the 7 aspirations flagged in the Agenda 2063 of the African Union. And so I chose aspiration number 7, which talks about Africa as a strong, united, resilient, and influential global player and partner. And I resonated with this a lot because I thought each of those components reflected something that I could contribute to in terms of the journey Africa is taking. And so the PowerPoint images are just supposed to provide triggers in your mind for the discussions we will have later as we begin to imagine the Africa that we would like to see manifest itself. Because the theme is a desire for an Africa that we either actually have reached or one that we are hoping to arrive at together. And so if we want an Africa that's a global player, that is influential, that is one that is united, that is strong and resilient, we will need to think very carefully on who we partner with, what knowledge we bring into the continent, what creative thoughts we collaboratively generate together. And so I aligned my personal interest with each of those particular core themes. And I thought, if we're going to get to Africa in just about 45 to 50 years' time, to be strong, we need to have a very strong foundation. And I thought our foundation lies in education. The role of education then becomes something that we can discuss over the next 15 minutes. If we want to be united, and I had a bit of a thought of resilience, we need to really maximize on the capacity we have in Africa, which is our youth. We have over 65% youth who are under the age of 35 in Africa currently, and they are the growing population on a global scale. And then I thought, if you want to be resilient, we're going to have to collaborate and cooperate together. If we want to have influence in the global scale, we need to have strong governance and leadership systems. That's at a state level, at a local community level, and fundamentally, for my interest, at an individual level, where I locate leadership capacity. And finally, to succeed in our endeavor, we'll need to do it together. And that's fundamentally my message for the day over the next things, is that we're going to have to work very hard together to realize our vision. So in Africa, we always go back to our culture, to our knowledge, and I'm sure many of you know this proverb: if you want to go quickly, we can do it alone. But if you want to go further together, we're going to have to do it as a community that is agreed, and we can decide which lens we want to put on. So I chose one of those pictures because that's our emerging fine art in Africa, and I think that's a very important factor to include as well. So where do we begin? We're looking at encouraging people to contribute to a lifelong learning journey. UNESCO invited the students and the professionals of the world to say that we never actually stop learning. However, are we adequately equipping our current young generation with the skills and the tool sets required to succeed in the future professional spaces that they will go into? So I'm beginning to highlight 21st century skills. We're into the 21st century. The foundational aspects, the competencies, the characteristics, and the qualities of that successful future African professional, which the university, and we're celebrating the journeys universities have taken over the last 51 years, has an imperative to develop. And so Stephen Covey says, the call and need of a new era is for greatness. Tapping into the higher reaches of human genius and motivation requires leaders to have a new mindset, a new skill set, and a new tool set. Therefore, locating individual leadership as personal drivers, as personal aspirations, as those goals and desires that each of you individually enabling and encouraging yourselves to achieve, you need to start looking ahead. And a lot of what we'll talk about is looking at the current time, being prepared for a future time while building on a past lesson. And so we can see under a 5-year period, the competencies and the skills required by the business and the professional and the corporate world, which all of you will shift into after university, are changing. It used to be people management, being able to solve a problem through complexity. But now we have critical thinking and creativity coming up into the top 3. Interestingly enough, the focus at institutional levels is on the top 3. So if you want to develop your CV, these are what the incoming employers are looking for in our current generation. You can go and find these anywhere. I'm not going to focus on the 10. We're looking at creativity, complex problem skills, and critical thinking. So in order to then achieve those 3 competencies, the future workforce is going to be able to manage a lot of data, right? You're going to have to be able to do cognitive load management. You're going to need to be able to have a cross-cultural competency. Increasingly, international dimensions are coming into every working space, every social space. So no longer do we have single demographic groups occupying one space. There's going to be somebody from another country, another culture, another religion, another sexual orientation, another perspective, another educational discipline, another characteristic for leadership. We're going to have to be able to make sense of the environments that we're in. That's one of the theories that I based my PhD in, is are we able to fully come into a space and define the variables that we have to use, the obstacles that we have to overcome, the social capital that we have to generate to be able to engage with others on a one-on-one basis. So then I come to the personal core competency basis. And I say, as a future leader, you will be able to learn. You should always be able to learn. The university then has a responsibility to create the possibility for this to occur, an ability to work in a team early on, an ability to work with transparency and to have values and ethics that run throughout the gamut of your research. We need to be able to share our values and be able to openly direct our questions and our inquiry on the shifting African region and where we want to take it. So while I am talking about Africa on a regional scale, I'm always locating the responsibility for action, the agent, at the role of the individual. And so when we come to look at how we build a strong Africa and how we build a resilient and united Africa, I locate the agent, the actor, at the individual level. So some statistics of where we're going, because it's the role of the youth. This is the current population trend for Africa on a global comparative level. So you can see the green line is Asia. They have had a very large population, but they're tapering off in terms of their growth. The purple line is Africa, and we're making a steady increase all the way, as you've seen, we've gone to the end of the century. And that is something we need to consider. The other regions are not actually increasing their populations, but that decline has been seen, and we have observed it currently. When we come to Africa, then, the youth are our capital. They are our workforce, they are our generative ability, and they are growing at a very steady pace. Our generational gap is not decreasing, but there is an increase slightly on those who will have to hand over the mantle of leadership. In Africa, there's a continual intergenerational dialogue that will need to happen if we are seeking to realize a successful economic, social, and political space. So the method that I recommend we apply to succeed in our seeking an Africa that is inclusive and diverse is to apply an instructional design learning methodology. So as educationalists, learning by doing is a method that encourages not only a theoretical, sitting in a classroom, receipt of knowledge, but a practical, ongoing, never-ending application of that knowledge on a real-time basis. Part of the work that I do then is always developing opportunities for students to learn in professional spaces, to learn to do what they have learned, and to realize that learning always occurs in the context of a desired goal. If our desired goal is an Africa that is useful, we still need leadership pathways that encourage students, on the one hand, to process facts, the basic elements of our knowledge content, to be able to acquaint themselves with their disciplines and to solve problems adequately, to be able to conceive of the concepts, the interdisciplinary spaces, and to be able to structure them in a large framework and to connect the pieces. What are the challenges of economics? How do we achieve social equity and gender equity? Procedurally, we need to have methods of putting together the challenges that we have, and then we need to decide what our common purpose is. Who are the people who are going to do it? What are the shared objectives we're going to realize? And what are our pathways to success? Coming from a student affairs background, we found that within an inter-university space, you really need to provide a co-curriculum that is interdisciplinary, that has training sessions for students, such as these spaces, seminars for knowledge exchange, co-curricular spaces for discrete but also critical analysis by students, critical dialogue, and innovation through technology. I'm going to swiftly go through the next 5 minutes. So in Africa, we have a lot of graduates. All those wonderful things and skills, we have them. Students are doing well, they're excelling, they're going to other regions of the world. In Africa, when they graduate, there are challenges of youth unemployment. We have this happening all over the world. They're asking, what happens now when I'm done with my graduate degree? And so my focus is on creating student leaders who are able to govern themselves, who are able to govern through committee practice, who are able to govern through dialogue, knowing that if we are able to create an understanding of what a national, societal, and individual governance framework looks like, we will then be able to encourage an ability to consult and to engage in collaborative practice. At a leadership level, we have old managerial style frameworks that no longer fit the new organization. We have come to a flat, hierarchical organizational structure where leadership is no longer at the top of that 8th floor, 13th floor, but it's right down to where everybody can sit in open and flat spaces. And we're moving through crisis management. We're in a crisis. Leadership right now cannot engage with that shift, and we're moving to a transformative space that is more responsive, effective, and efficient. As I just go to my last couple of slides, the Chinese proverb says, "Tell me and I will forget. Show me and I remember. Involve me and I will understand." We have come to a point where we absolutely have to include the young people in Africa. So, more than just saying you can do it and you're the future and you're wonderful and you're very intelligent and you've got all the capacity, we have an opportunity now to actually let young people do it. They can do this, and in order for us to get to a point of agreement on what that doing is, we'll need to really determine what our common goal is. What Africa do we want, actually? Is it an Africa that has a strong currency? Is it an Africa that has one passport? Is it an Africa that has free movement of people and goals? Is it an Africa where we're all employed? Soon, this is the challenge we're going to deal with. Incoming technology, artificial intelligence. 2018 is the transition year, colleagues. We're there. Which means that the technological tools that we will apply in our new working spaces will determine the professions that me included will shift into over the next 10, 15, maximum 20 years. So these are the declines of the professions that we are already in. So if you're an archaeologist, if you're an architect, if you're a medic, if you're a paramedic, go and find where the future of your trajectory will take you, and then we can discuss the Africa that we are trying to go towards. Please understand that this is not a conclusive view. We can all succeed in the area, but there are trends, because increasing automation, reducing the cost on very basic administrative skills is going to become the major priority for large organizations. Therefore, the legal industry, the accounting industry, the measurement industry, assessment, the evaluation and the methods-based are really going to become automated. Even education and teaching and learning is going to be impacted by these spaces. So, these are the drivers: changing global workforce, super structured organizations, huge organizations where you don't even have an office to go to, extreme longevity. That means people are living longer. They're living to 100, 110, 120, and they're still contributing to society. We have computational thinking, and we need to therefore build suitable ecosystems. My last point, and I really will finish, thank you so much for the timing, is the work that I am now in, linking what we learn, why we learn it, how we learn it, and how we apply it to a continent that begins to reflect the diversity that we are. So the Global Sullivan Principles, very basic, said we need to have universal human rights. We need to have a protection for health and the environment. It's very basic. And we need to promote sustainable development. This was in the context of business, right at the moment when South Africa was saying we are no longer going to do business with these companies during the apartheid region. And the Global Sullivan Principles really enabled South Africa to extricate all of those corporates that were no longer contributing to the society. And I think we are now at another place where we say if we are to learn to live together and build a society that is inclusive of business and individuals and the nation, we're going to have to get good at it at an individual level. The university is the space that cultivates that capacity, that fosters the cooperative mindset. And if we focus, because I'm an international student and someone who's learned to live in very many countries, I believe that this is the vision. We are a very big continent, we have a lot of space, we have billions of people. Kwame Nkrumah said, I am not an African because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was born in me. And so today my invitation to you, and as I open to my next colleagues to present, is to say we're a mix, we're a puzzle, they can't quite figure us out on an international scale. We need to figure ourselves out, our priorities. Agenda 2063 outlines them for us, but we're in the middle of a shift, and an energetic shift that we can capitalize on in an economic and a social and also a professional level, but we need to support the individual to transition through this stage. So we need to focus individually on students at an undergraduate level in the university to build a capacity for engagement with senior leaders, to be able to stand on platforms like this and clearly articulate ideas about where the future of Africa will go. And so I just close to say that really at the end of the day, businesses and organizations will look to inviting those students who are able to independently and with confidence share what they think the future will look like. And I think I just wanted to share one last quote from Martin Luther King, who was asked, what do you mean when you say you have a dream? And he said, we all need to take time on what it means to have a dream. And he said, okay. He said, I have a dream. And so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. Martin Luther said this on 28 August 1963 at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And then they asked him, and when are you going to have this dream? He said, what do you mean? I have a dream today. Thank you very much.
I'm sure that you will agree with me that I really wish we would have had more time today. I can think of at least 5 specific questions that I would have loved to ask you. I particularly appreciated the fact that you referred to the SCAR model, the skills, knowledge, and competencies, and the attitude and attributes that we need to focus on. And for many years, the focus was on what we typically call hard skills and soft skills, and also phrases that I really do not like, and that your focus is also addressing the big fear that we have for this fourth industrial revolution. So on the one hand, we've got this strong message that we are the future and that we are the people who have to create the future that we want. And yet, I think we might sit there today and wonder, but how are we going to do it collaboratively? So my second appreciation for you also is the fact that you emphasize the importance of choosing your partners wisely in this process of change. And I'm sure that a lot of questions will follow on those 2 particular elements. Then, ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker, from a student perspective, really does not need a lot of introduction. Eduard Beukman is a very active student in the curriculum and co-curriculum space at Stellenbosch University. He's currently doing his BA in Humanities. He's just been elected on the SRC, representing the Academic Council, ABR. And he is a very passionate student who acknowledges and realized exactly what our previous speaker, Nyambura, referred to, that our co-curriculum spaces and the natural transient, fluid wave of knowledge from the curriculum into the co-curriculum is so important. And I really look forward to you sharing that perspective with the audience, but also particularly from a student point of view. So welcome.
Okay, let me just adjust this. All right, cool. Good afternoon, everyone. I was advised to be like the oaks of Stellenbosch and remain rooted here on this podium, because if any of you have heard me speak before, I love to walk around, I love to move around, but I will remain rooted. And also, I promise I am part of the youth, despite all of my grey hair. My ID says my age, it is real, it is a real ID, so from my perspective, I chose aspiration number 6, which focuses on an Africa whose development is people-driven, relying on the potential of African people, especially its women, youth, and caring for children. Now, I'm going to mainly focus on the youth aspect and from the university side of university students, because everything I will talk about should also be, in my opinion, applicable to high school, to primary school, and to any form of education. And I'm glad that our previous speaker, Dr. Mwagiru, spoke about a lot of the stuff, because it means that I was on a right track, I hope, for a lot of the things that I speak about that overlap a little. So, the theme for this year is that we achieving the Africa we want and the role of young people. It's auspicious for us at this time at Stellenbosch, because we have now gone through our centenary, where we have celebrated and reflected, and we now have looked at the past the same way the AAU last year, when it had its 50th. Last year's theme was AAU at 50, which all focused on where we've come and how we have gotten here. But now it's time where we've started saying, where are we going and where are we going to take it? Because I think that's something we as the youth have a very large role to play in. And that's why this aspiration actually for me focuses on all of them. If you want to, the development of our people on this continent will lead to a prosperous Africa, an integrated Africa, an Africa founded on good governance, democracy, and a peaceful and secure continent, one with a strong cultural identity and heritage, and also a strong and influential continent in the world that we play in. Because at the end of the day, it's about us as people and individuals and our communities and the spaces that we work in. So from my side, there's one of the key ways to develop our people is through education and the opportunities that they can have through this. But there's a short-term need and a long-term need for our continent. In 2000, there were 2.5 million people in higher education in Africa. 2010, it was 5. It is now estimated to be 10. And this is a huge increase and a huge demand that has developed. But what I've noticed in the last 2 years is there's a strong focus on when we say there's a development deficit. We must focus on postgraduates. We must make sure that more and more PhDs are produced and so forth. And that is amazing. That is what we need. But there's so much more that can be done for our undergraduates and for all of us who sit here. Because at the end of the day, while Stellenbosch has 66% undergrads and 33% postgrads, the rest of the continent is 90-95% undergrads. There are many universities that do not even have capacity or finance to do postgraduate education. So when we teach and undergrads have to learn, what do they learn and how? Because for me, it's not just the content that we have had, especially in South Africa, which we've had a long discussion about, but the way we're being taught. Is it relevant still? In the way that we are being, or our teaching and learning systems are approached to this 21st century that Dr. Mwagiru spoke about, is it creating or developing individuals that have those competencies and skills? Because I'm glad they were mentioned. I even thought for creativity, of curiosity, of communication, collaboration, cooperation, and coordination, those C's, they are what leaders, and I found interesting about the co-curriculum of Stellenbosch University, that is what we want in our leaders. But isn't that something that we can all have and all develop and all be engaged in? And I think that's what the co-curriculum office allows at this university, is that any of us can be involved and any of us can engage in these spaces to learn these competencies outside of the classroom. Because we are on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to all be automated and that all of our jobs are going to disappear. There are jobs that will be disappeared, or that will disappear, but with the skills of being creative, of being entrepreneurial. And being entrepreneurial doesn't mean you have to start a business. You can be entrepreneurial in any job that you have or any space that you're in. Because at the end of the day, if you see something that is missing, take it. See if you can make it. See if you can put it in. And what I've noticed at Stellenbosch as well is that it's been an inviting space in its own ways about new ideas. And that's why one of the things that I've been focusing on is to create a journal for undergraduates and honors students. It's the same academic journal with the same peer review processes, the same editorial standards for our students to be publishing. But then also to see how can we invite the co-curriculum and the curriculum to teach our undergrads these skills. Because it's not so much of a lecture or me standing in front of all of you and teaching these things, because I'm here to provoke, or I'm here to make you think. But there's so much more that you, when you leave here, and hopefully with these ideas, can do with. So how do we prepare for it? Because if we are learning for the future, does our current model properly prepare? And with all of our undergraduates, that's a resource that is there. And this is where research-based learning is something that is so important. And I love Dr. Mwagiru's also the point of doing. There's so much more you learn by doing. I, at least in all of the work that I've done, I can say being at the international office as an intern or any other job that I've had to do, you learn a lot more while you do something than you will in your classroom. The classroom helps, and that's where we can try and that's where we can do the innovation and try and see where we can bring that curriculum and co-curriculum and the work that we end up having to do together. So if we, as university students, learn little about how to apply, and that's what I think something that we've had to learn a lot more of, and especially in the last decade has been coming up, is how do we apply what we learn? And speaking back to being an entrepreneur or trying to think of how do we engage with each other? Because at the end of the day, we can know our field, we can know it, but how do we actually operate and contribute within it with the professional skills that we develop while we work, or even yet what we learn beforehand? So at the end of this means that the complex problems of the 21st century will require that transdisciplinary and participative education. We have to participate. We have to be part of that development, because I think as a lecturer, teachers, it is awesome, but there's so much that we also do not know and can, as students and as the youth of the future, contribute and participate, because I think we both have something to learn from each other. And I think that's also a conversation that's been happening all across the continent, is about how involved should youth be in politics and decision-making and in X, Y, and Z. But at the end of the day, it's a huge thing of it is are we going to do it together? Because just as a few more statistics, in 2040, Africa will have the world's largest labor force. The largest. Larger than China. There will be 1 billion of us who are of working age, and 40% of them will be the youth. Yet, at current projections, or at least in some projections, 60% of them will be unemployed. And yet, in the beginning of my speech, more and more people are accessing higher education. More and more people are going to institutions where they are gaining skills. But is that the match of what they are learning and being taught, matching to what they can do on the outside? Because at the end of the day, it's also we're not a labor factory or knowledge factory as a university. We must not just be prepared to work. We must be prepared to change and engage and contribute and build. Because I don't know, if you came to university just to get a job, I don't know, I would feel very sad. For myself anyway, I'd feel very sad, because then it's like just one step more on the ladder till there's no more ladder to climb and I get buried or cremated. So it's something that there's so much more we can learn while we are here. And is that the future we want? This future of automation, unemployment, the challenges we have. And I think that's something that I don't think any of us do want, but it's about where we fit in as the youth and the elders. Because again, it is not us alone or the elder generation alone. It is all of us. Because even though this is the last idea that I want us to just think about at the end of the day is, do we inherit the future as the youth? Do we inherit it? Or with all of the structural inequalities that are in place in South Africa and across the world, do we inherit that future, or will we do our part to drive, to construct and co-create that future so that we can all inhabit a place that we are happy with? Thank you.
Left us with a few questions, and moving from the technical side of an automation of our future, but also taking us back to the respect and the value, and perhaps not valuing enough our elders in our immediate environment. And that is something that our counterparts in Ghana yesterday at their celebrations were particularly focusing on. So one of your questions was, how involved and should the youth be in politics? And one of our colleagues in Ghana argued that the amount of pressure there is on young people today to explore is not supported by the older generation, in a sense that we are not opening up those opportunities where decisions are being made about youth. So I'm going to pause and leave that question for our panel for later, because I think that is a central question for this year's theme, which our counterparts across the continent is also questioning. This brings me to our last speaker before we open the floor for questions, and that is the Aspiration 1, a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. And no better person fit to address that particular topic than our guest speaker that we've invited today to address that specific aspiration. A little bit more about Farai. Now, Farai is one of those names that before I came to Stellenbosch, or back to Stellenbosch, that was just one of those buzzwords within the leadership space. And so I was very fortunate today to have met you for the first time, but it felt like I know you much, much better for various reasons. I think you epitomize what we also like to see in 21st century leadership and the theory that we refer to when we talk about the characteristics of a 21st century leader, where you either identify opportunities, you have an entrepreneurial mindset, but you're also someone who takes an idea and you involve people. And that ripple effect is, I think, what makes you an amazing person to be honored, and no wonder that you've reaped the rewards for that attitude. So Farai is a junior project manager at the Oram Institute, a leading African TB and HIV research and implementation institute. Prior to Oram, she was an intern at the South African Institute of International Affairs. She achieved a distinction for her MSc in the political economy of emerging markets at King's College in London, and her dissertation on South African private companies and black women examined the effect of the Employment Equity Act affirmative action policy on the representation, corporate experience, and career projection of black women. Prior to her master's, she worked at Deloitte as an analyst for strategy and operations consulting. She is the co-founder of the youth-led organization Africa Matters. Africa Matters empowers young Africans to lead through leadership skills, capacity building, and community impact projects. Farai, as we all know, is a Queen's Young Leader for South Africa for 2017, was awarded in 2017, a One Young World Ambassador, and a King's Principles Global Leadership Award recipient. and she was recently named as one of the top 100 Mandelas of the future by Media24. Without further ado, Farai.
Thank you so much, Heidi, for that introduction. I really, really appreciate it. So I'm really excited to be here. I don't think I would like to spend my birthday anywhere else. I made sure that I was able to see my mum off this morning, and she complained again, being like, this is the 5th year you've traveled on your birthday. But I'm always at home anyway, so that makes up for it. And thank you, I'm really honored to be here. So this morning, during my 6 a.m. flight, I sat next to a man who was reading a book. And the title of the book was, What on Earth Are You Here For? And I glanced at it, and he saw me glance at it, and we had that awkward eye contact. And I think what's fantastic is that I then reflected on that question, and I said to myself, what on earth am I here for? And to follow up from the brilliant speech that Eduard just did, I want to ask you who are here in the room today, what on earth are you here for? And not just within this context of being in this room today, but especially for those of you who are students. Why are you a student? And why are you studying what you are studying? So I'm going to give you time to reflect on that, and then at the end of this presentation, I'll definitely come back to those questions. So today we're essentially looking at how do we achieve the Africa that we want? And this is especially from the eyes of young people. How can we achieve an Africa that we are proud of? And the theme I chose to focus on was looking at it from the perspective of inclusive growth and sustainable development. That's one of the African Union's aspirations. They want us to achieve a prosperous Africa. So, let me point at the right thing. So, how do we achieve a prosperous Africa, right? What does this phrase even mean? What does it mean for us to have a prosperous Africa that is based on inclusive growth and sustainable development? Can anyone answer that? What if I offered you a free t-shirt that's titled, "We are the ones we've been waiting for"? There's no wrong answers. Okay, I'll ask more questions as we go on. And the reason I ask what that means is because I think that very often in this world of wanting to use UN terms and fancy generic development languages, we often lose the meanings of these things. We don't really understand how they truly do affect us. And because of that, I then said to myself, for me as a young African person, what does it mean for us to achieve inclusive growth? What is sustainable development for Africa? And so I toyed around with these concepts and these ideas in my head, and this is what I perceive as being a prosperous Africa. And you're welcome to disagree with me, and I'd be happy for questions. But this, to me, looks like prosperity. It is an Africa that has got inclusive economic growth, and by that I mean that it's not just economic growth for those who can afford, but it's also for the have-nots. And it's also not using GDP as a measure of economic growth, because I think that's a really misleading measure. Then it's a reduction in inequality and unemployment, because a nation can never prosper for as long as we still have these gaping holes of inequality. Third will be the eradication of poverty, but not quick fixes. How do we sustainably, as nations in this continent, eradicate poverty? And how do we do this without compromising future generations, right? How do we ensure that in all of our developments and our changes that we are sustainable in the way we do things? And the last thing, which I've emphasized, is how do we place youth at the center? And I emphasize that because of the fact that, and my two speakers mentioned it before, but Africa has the largest youth population in the world. We have 226 million young people between 15 and 24. A country like Uganda, 80% of Ugandans are under 18. How are we ensuring that we are creating an Africa that is able to place youth at the center? Because in the next few years, and already at present, it is young people who are experiencing this African growth and this African development that we talk about. So how do we achieve a prosperous Africa? Because I think that we've got these aspirations, but how do we actively achieve that? And if we use this definition, can we ask ourselves, what have we done in the past? And what are we currently doing to work towards this? And how can we improve methods so that we change and we really achieve this prosperity that we want going forward? So to achieve this, I want us to take a look at some past examples, right? So what we know is that Africa, like many other continents, experienced colonization, amongst other things. We've had a lot of external influences. So because of these influences, our concept of economic growth was a very top-down approach. For a long time, African growth was based on how can we be like the US? How can I be like the UK? Putting us on unequal footing with these other countries. And the sad aspect about this is that for as long as we choose to develop using prescriptive World Bank or IMF-based approaches, we can never really grow our countries because we never started off on the same foot to begin with. Now, the example I want to take you through is looking at Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone in the early 90s decided to accept loans from the World Bank. And because of that, the World Bank said, cool, we'll give you a lot of money to fix your country, but these are the conditions. And how it currently works is that even if you say no to the World Bank and you go to the IMF, they have what they call cross-conditionalities, where there's no way of escaping the conditions that these big institutions give to you. So the government of Sierra Leone said, we actually really want to grow, so we will accept these loan conditions. And what came with those conditions is that the government had to reduce their budgets for social services. So these are important things like healthcare, like child services, like social protection. And this has been done not only in African countries, but also in Latin American countries. And because of that, that's what we refer to as the failure of these structural adjustment programs. And I highlight that to show you that, okay, so before our view of economic development or of development was very American-style approaches. What has happened since, and have we learned our lesson? What's happened since then is that a few years later, and many of you will remember that just a few years ago, we had the Ebola outbreak in not only countries like Sierra Leone, but in Liberia and other neighboring countries. Because of the cuts that happened, that the government had done in the early 90s, the Sierra Leonean government was not equipped to deal with the outbreak of the Ebola virus. They didn't have enough healthcare workers. They didn't have a budget to deal with these. All of their great doctors had left the countries. And I highlight this to show you that as Africans, we need to get to a stage where we stop idealizing our own growth after the growth of other countries. It's not sustainable. It doesn't work. What we need to do is to be bold enough in understanding where our flaws are, where our strengths are, and in charting our own development. So let's not be sad and let's look at a happier example, which would be Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia, yes, it was the only country in Africa that was not technically colonized. However, it doesn't mitigate the amazing successes that they've had in that country. What Ethiopia has done really, really well is that it's charted its own development. Ethiopia's government created their national development plan and said, this is how I want to grow my country. Yes, there are other ways that can be imposed by other countries, but this is how I see my country's growth. And I will then partner with whoever I need to partner with to achieve that growth. So because of that approach, we've seen amazing benefits of this thing called South-South collaborations, where your what's called developing countries or poorer countries have partnered to achieve great sustainable development. Now, what does this look like for Ethiopia? So what you've got is that Ethiopia said to China, you guys are amazing at agricultural trade, manufacturing, and infrastructure. Come into our country, obviously we'll have to negotiate that, but build our capacity. But also don't just build our capacity, ensure that there's skills transfer. So you've got a lot of what they call these special economic zones within Ethiopia, where there's direct skills transfer happening. They then said to South Korea, we really like your education system. Come into Ethiopia and teach us a lot of how you do things. Let's also exchange lecturers. Let's exchange students. So because of this, there's been this influx of new knowledge, of new ways of doing things into Ethiopia. Then the last thing they said to India was, damn, guys, I really like your skills. They didn't actually say this. I'm just, acting it out. They said, I really like your skills. can you actually come into our country and transfer those skills and develop our people? Let's do study tours. Let's get to understand each other's cultures a lot more. And I think this is a really, really fantastic way of seeing how a country can say, this is how I want to develop. This is how I want to take my country forward. And I've done it through a consultative process with different people. So now I want to highlight how I think we can build on this Ethiopian model of Africans charting their own development. And there's 3 suggestions I'd like to take us through. The first one is that we need to put youth at the center of economic growth. And I emphasize this because, as mentioned earlier, we've got such a big youth population. And about 33 African countries have got separate youth policies. But if your youth policy is completely separate from your social policy or your economic policy, then you're not actually addressing anything, because youth are an integral part of every part of society. The other reason why it's also important to ensure that youth are included in development is so that if we're wanting a sustainable Africa, an Africa that is prosperous, we need to ensure that there is involvement of youth in this prosperity so that they can be the ones to continue it. The second aspect I want to highlight is that we need a multi-stakeholder approach to how we achieve development. I went to a job summit last week, Tuesday, and in the job summit you had a big group of unemployed young people who were angry at the systems and angry at the government and angry at the NYDA. You then had a lot of corporates that were there. Anglo-American was there, Deloitte was there. And what happened is that the young people in the audience started to say, we hate all these corporates, you don't do anything for us, and started booing corporates off the stage. Now, what's the problem with that? If you've got an executive from Anglo there, and you're an unemployed youth, should the best option for you not be to go up to him and be like, Andile, listen, I don't have a lot of work experience, but I am ready to work. I am ready to ensure that I am growing, and I'm ready to change my narrative. The exec from Anglo was booed, and he left. And will he ever attend a job summit again, asking to engage with young people? I doubt it. So how do we ensure that we've got multi-stakeholder approaches where we're not playing the blame game? We're acknowledging that, hey, corporate South Africa does have a lot more to do, and that's not my defense here. But it's to say, let's acknowledge that, and then let's create sustainable solutions so that we can tackle these issues together. The last thing I want to highlight is that we need a lot more youth action to address these social issues. And the previous speakers mentioned it, that, youth action need a lot of support. And they need not just this acknowledgement of, great young people, you're doing a good job, but they actually need that support and investment in young people. So, bearing all of this in mind, are there tangible ways in which we can achieve this? Is it possible for us to do this? And I want to encourage all of you here today that it's not about making these big, massive contributions and saving the world. That's going to get you there. I think often when we think of change, we think of these large-scale things. But I want to show you 2 small projects that, because we started them small and then grew them, have since achieved amazing impact and contribute to this idea of a prosperous Africa. The first one is Africa Matters. Now, many of you will know that Riyadh and I started Africa Matters when I was in my 3rd year. We're both in our 3rd year, actually. And we said to ourselves, this campus is so interesting. This country is so interesting. South Africa is one of the few countries I've been to where, by the very virtue of the fact that I am not 100% South African, I'm shunned from discussions. Rianne, on the other hand, her being American, was more invited into conversations because it's this American flavor that's coming into conversations. Why is it that when I enter a room as someone that has a Zimbabwean parent, I'm told I'm not South African enough, I can't be in the room? And such experiences happened even while I was here on campus. Why is it that as a country we're so divided, as a continent we're so divided? I remember when the German exchange students would come, everyone would be so excited. Everyone went onto Tinder and was really excited about that. But what happens when African students are on campus? Where is that same excitement there? Where is that same excitement of, oh, you know what, I need to make friends with a Nigerian friend because I want to go to Nigeria and I want to understand her country? Instead, it was, oh, I need to make friends with a German friend so I can go to the EU and hopefully immigrate. Like, why do we have these views and these, I think, really skewed ideologies of one another? And also, it doesn't help the fact that Africa's got this emerging youth population. So every day, millions of kids are being brought up into a continent where its own young people don't even want to be a part of it. How do we change that? So to change that, Rianne and I said, let's create a movement. And initially, it was just meant to be a movement that was going to end really quickly after we had finished our studies here. And we wanted to really address this issue of, first of all, us not understanding our continent. Secondly, there not being enough skills within our continent. And how do we tackle that? And so we created this youth skills development organization, but also I'd also call it a knowledge creation organization, where we'd host different things, be it workshops on African identity. Just last weekend, we did a seminar on career strategy and planning. We looked at leadership skills as well, to ensure that young Africans are not only learning about the continent, but are building skills to lead the continent in their different communities. Today, we're still a small team. A lot of people think Africa Matters is really big, and we always get requests for money, and I'm like, guys, I'm so broke. Why do people think that? But we have a team of 6, a core team of 6, and we've got 9 African ambassadors. That means we've got ambassadors in Kenya, Rwanda, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, who are all doing the work that we've taught them to do through Africa Matters. And this is a small-scale organization that has since grown so significantly. And it all started here. In fact, it started just outside Sonop, which is where I used to stay. The other project I'm very excited to share with you is what's called the Oram Unlocked project. So as mentioned before, I recently started working at Oram. Oram is a TB and HIV research institute. And the project that they gave me was to say to me, okay, Farai, there's 2 big issues in South Africa. We've got high levels of HIV and TB. In fact, HIV in South Africa is currently at 7.5 million people. We then also have really high levels of youth unemployment, which is at 53.7%. So 1 in every young person is unemployed in this country. They said, we want you to lead us a project that's going to fix that. I said, cool. You do know I've got like a year of work experience. They're like, lead the project. I'm like, great. So what we do is that Oram has partnered with Unlocked. Unlocked is a youth talent sourcing organization. What we essentially do is that we put young people through a 1-year learnership. In the learnership, you get your CETA qualification, and you also do work experience with Oram. At the end of it, young people leave either being employed into Oram, so we either absorb you, or we put you into other implementing partners, so other healthcare organizations. The brilliance of this project is that we've had 80 young people come through who have gained amazing skills, because essentially for us to combat HIV and TB, we need more people on the ground. We need more people at clinics who are going to do the work. We've got 80 young people that have got this experience, that are coming in, gaining experience, and are changing their communities. All of the young people that we've got working with us come from disempowering backgrounds. All have been unemployed. A lot of them are the only ones in their families that actually make money. And a lot of them are on learnerships. And I think what's been so empowering is to see that actually we can do it. And we unlock money for this project from corporates. So we've said to corporates, you need to do better, work with us. We'll take the money. We'll ensure that young people are then put into jobs afterwards to ensure that they emerge as economically active citizens. And I want to quickly highlight Shonice. Shonice here, she actually called me just before this to be like, Farai, calm down. I know you're stressing. And I applaud her, because anyone that can work with me is a really strong person. And Shonice is from Regepak, which is in Gauteng, a poor colored community there. When we interviewed her, I went home and I said to my mom, me and this girl are so similar. I don't know how, but I just feel from interviewing her that we have the same personality. And this was my first week at work. Imagine a 23-year-old interviewing people from between the ages of 18 to 40. I kept on saying to myself, how can I, this youngster, interview people? How can I decide who should get a job and who should not? But I saw something really special in Shonice. And I went home and said, Mom, I don't know. I don't think she should work in the clinics. I think she should come and work with me. I then arranged it with my boss, and she's come on board. It has been amazing to see her growth. First of all, we're 5 days apart. I'm a bit older, which is fine. Both born in 94, both born into the same family structures. The only difference between the two of us is that we're born into different socioeconomic classes. That is literally the only difference between the two of us. Within the month that she's been with me at Oram, she's spoken on Talk Radio 702. 2 weeks ago, she presented to the board, and one of our board members is the guy that created Discovery Bank. Her life will never be the same, and it's all because we started a small-scale project that we're now scaling up and up and up. Our goal is by December to have 700 young people in the program, and by March next year, I'm convinced my boss is trying to kill me, to have 5,000 young people in the program. And then every year to ensure that there's 10,000 young people being put into industry and having permanent employment afterwards. And so, oopsie, I just did something wrong. Oh, there we go. And so my question to you is, are you contributing to Africa's prosperity? And I especially ask this again, and this relates to the question I asked earlier. For those of you who are here as students, as a student, it becomes so easy to say, I'm just here because I want a job, like was mentioned before. When I started to study, I just wanted to work at Deloitte. That was all I wanted to do. And then I got there and I was like, not that it's a bad firm, it's an amazing firm, but there must be something else for me. There must be something else that I can do that is of impact. So I want to ask you today, what can you do that is of impact? And when you go home, think about how will you contribute to Africa's prosperity? Because we all have a role to play in it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Farai. I couldn't have imagined that we could have ended on a better note and more relevant note than a challenge, a conversation, a question that was posed by someone who was born in the year 1994, when South Africa celebrated our first democratic election and our freedom per se, but also with a very clear message for all of us that freedom really starts with the freedom of mind. And you've mentioned earlier on how do we change and what are we here for, and how do we free our minds, and a simple way by doing that, as we were taught in way back many years ago in anthropology, to change cultures and customs depends on two things, space and time. And I think for me it was encouraging to sit here and to listen to the three of you coming from different perspectives and addressing different aspirations, but your messaging is so clear that it really begins with the self and the freedom of the mind and self-belief. So I would like to thank you and also congratulate you for the way that you've inspired us in this limited space and time. This brings me to the end of my wonderful job for the day, and that's to introduce our facilitator, Mohini Catelli. She's a student at the Faculty of Education with an interest in internationalization of higher education. Her master's thesis focused on the experiences of Black foreign postgraduate students in an historically white institution in South Africa. She's also the chairperson of the African Student Board, ASB, and vice chairperson of the Lesotho Student Society. Mohini, it's now all over to you.
Thank you. I thought I was audible. Anyway, we have 20 minutes for questions and answers. And since I have been given the mic, I think I should just take the opportunity and ask the first question. We'll take 3 questions from the audience and then ask our panelists to deliberate. And if we have time left, we'll continue until the 20 minutes is over. So it's very thought-provoking what they were talking about. And my interest, as Heidi mentioned from my study, is on the internationalization of higher education, and particularly historically white institutions. But I'm very interested in what you said, Eduard, about educating the youth and educating women. And my interest really is on how we break cultural stereotypes. Heidi mentioned this, because Africans are very culturally orientated, and for the longest time, women were not to be educated because they would be married into another family. So how do we break cultural stereotypes, as Heidi said, and then educate the woman and educate the girl child? Because like the 2015 International Women's Day celebration said educating a girl child is educating the nation. So how do we move from our African being of not educating girls and bringing girls and youth into education to achieve the Africa that we want? So I'm going to leave it there and maybe pass the mic around to the audience to have 2 more questions and then let the panelists respond.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank the speakers. My name is Matia, I'm Ugandan. Maybe one thing I missed among the speakers today was the issue of the diffusivity of us Africans. She highlighted the issue of Ethiopia and the development, but you are aware about the clashes going on between the ethnic groups. The Oromo people are choosing the leadership minority and all that. And we know all this dislike among African brothers and other things. So I think we need to emphasize the role of unity of Africans, basically, before we can even think about development, because if each of us thinks about just themselves, then I don't see any development. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Matia. Any other person? The back.
Is it on? Thank you so much for the thought-provoking sort of presentation. I think I really enjoyed it, and I had a lot of questions that I was asking myself as a young African person. However, I really think that the Africa that we want to see in our role as young people in Africa is centered around the agenda of the African Union, which basically none of you panelists actually touched on that, which I think what we build in Africa somehow is centered around that. But the second thing is, perhaps, Dr. Mwagiru, I want to ask a question around collaborations. You spoke that we needed to choose the right partner, which I think I really agree with you. But say Africa was a family, do you somehow choose the brother or the sister you are born with? So in that context, how do you choose who to partner? Are you choosing a partner within the African continent, or perhaps we are talking about something which is called the transcontinental dimension, which is already being done with the BRICS? And I suppose if that's what you're proposing, let's perhaps ask a question, which epistemology then we're going to use to facilitate growth within Africa? Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. I'll pass over to the panelists now. Eduard, would you want to go first?
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So from my side, this is what makes it so important about that breaking down of walls. Because one thing I've noticed in the research that I've been working on and what I've been doing now, there's walls even just between postgrads and undergrads. There's a whole, we've almost stratified ourselves into different groups and to different ways of thinking. And to be able to break down a lot of those walls from what I was talking about was one of the best ways to be able to implement education for everyone. Because when it comes to educating the girl child to be entrepreneurial, to be engaged and creative, to be able to work within all of these spaces, it's about also then acknowledging that there's potential and the ability. Because a lot of challenges that I would think based on this is that we have this perception. We have perceptions of people based on who they are, what they look like, based on their gender, their religion. We have so many of these perceptions that need to be broken down around this. So that's why it's so important to be able to break down a lot of the barriers within the education system itself, as well as on the outside, because when the youth have that opportunity to change that. And I think that's something that I would also ask everyone here to actually also consider, because what we are inheriting as well is also something that we have to look forward to in the future of how do we want Africa to look like.
Okay, so just to answer the one on Africa's divisions, especially culturally and yeah, definitely religiously as well. There is a lot of division in Africa, whether you're in Kenya, South Africa, Ethiopia, like you mentioned. And I think that what's at the root of these cultural divisions is a lack of understanding of the other, right? So very often, for example, when we've got things like xenophobic attacks in South Africa, those who do the acts of the attacks are those who don't understand what the economic circumstances of those who came here are anyway. And to be honest with you, and to share my own story, the reason my dad no longer lives in South Africa is because he was then a victim of xenophobic attacks a few years ago. So I think what's at the root of this is then how do we promote understanding with other Africans? And I think that what it comes down to is not only education, because education is important, and I think through learning about one another we can really break these divides, but also in having conversations with one another. I think too often the notion is that if you are Zulu, you stick to yourself. If you're Xhosa, you stick to yourself. And I even see that even after university. But how do we then create this notion of let's actually talk to one another, let's get to understand the other? And I think this comes down to what I mentioned before of, can we create more spaces? So let's not have one Africa Matters. Let's have even more. Let's quadruple that to ensure that we're creating spaces where we can have this conversation and this engagement with one another. A forum like this should not be the only time where many of you are seated here with people from other African countries. This should be the norm every single day. But it has to take many of us to actively want to do that, to make this happen.
Thank you very much for all your queries, and to my colleagues for their responses. Just on the last question, I come from a background that looks at the regional bodies in the African continent and the role that they have to play in advancing our development on a global level. So at the moment, the models that we have for development are based on European models that we are now beginning to apply. And so an epistemological view would be, what are the knowledge base that Africa is developing from? And so as a young student, I then had to expose myself to the literature coming from the early 1960s, early 1970s, learning about the structural adjustment programs and the ways in which Africa was had to engage with the international financial systems in order for us to get where we are. So political and economic theories of development have really been developed in other regions of the world. And there's an emerging discourse in the Africa region that requires us to respond, which we have been doing. But we need greater and stronger and more deepened academic and theoretical and pragmatic unraveling of all those theories that no longer apply. So when I talk about partnership, I talk about it at a theoretical level. What are the theories that we resonate with that reflect an Africa that is current? So an older generation might respond to the text by Walter Rodney in 1970s, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. So now we have to look at how the current globalization trends are impacting our ability to develop as a region. So partnership is at the level of corporate business. We have foreign direct investment that is coming in but is limited by the interest of corporations to engage in our African context because we are conflict regions. And that is not necessarily the truth. So the measures for engagement are very diverse and they're not necessarily reflective of an African reality. So we are still, the narrative of Africa is still a very negative one. A positive story, a positive narrative is beginning to be articulated by the current generation, but it still has a long way to go before it has an impact on those very, very ingrained methods of achieving those milestones. So partnership then has to be discerned. You have to discern the value of the partnership. So Africa is asking, what is the value of the partnership? We have very high outward-going financial flows, trillions of dollars are flowing out of Africa because the emerging model was an extractive model. You come, you build a railway, you take your ore, you take the ore out, we know the model. So to move to a new model is the partnership one. Who do I do business with? Who understands me and who do I understand? And if you come to our family, we will welcome you as a family would. So African knowledge is we are one. We need to unify on the agenda of that development. And the partnership discussion will come out of that, because that will outline what our colleagues have indicated are the proper stakeholders to engage in our future together.
Thank you. More questions from the floor, please. I recognize 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. I'll take all 5 of them, and then they'll respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mine is simple, you see. I will direct my question to Farai, by the way. I would like to know something. You spoke about what African youth, you see, comparing Africa to what? To Europe, you see. Therefore, like, I would like to be clarified based on the fact that, you see, I don't think that the problem of Africa, you see, it's all about doing what? We comparing Africa to what? To Europe by looking at the fact of history, you see. Like, if we are to look at history, like the Chinese, for instance, you see, they learned from the Russians, you see. Chairman Mao, by the way, when he stood up and said that now, you see, we need to do what? To compromise the what? The will of our people, you see, and the needs of our people, you see. It was because he learned it from the Russians. Therefore, we as Africans, I believe that we need to learn and take what is of value and leave what is of not, what doesn't have value. So, like, because, like, I mean, the issue is what? The citizenship, you see. Like, we recognizing ourselves as Africans and be proud of we being Africans. Like, for instance, we have Africans, you see, who does what? Like, I hope this is not seen as something else, but then we have Africans, you see, who leave Africa to Europe. When they get to Europe, you see, and flourish, we look at these kind of things as achievements, we as Africans here in this country, you see. Therefore, like, I would like to clarify this thing, like, and be clear with it. The fact that if it was Mugabe, like, let's take, for instance, Mugabe to call an African child and do what, and give them an opportunity, that is something that we are not going to look at it as what? As something that is good, or try to do what, to promote it. Therefore, I think the focus of African children is to do what that they need to do, is to sit down and start to do what, to praise what we have and be proud of what we have, and do what, and learn from others than we're trying to run away and do what from our own country, because we have become what? Beggars. Because, like, if you are to look at Africa, we have a lot of NGOs. These NGOs are not giving us knowledge, they are giving us food parcels that we must eat, and then after eating, we must go sleep, wake up tomorrow, go back. We need knowledge on the ground so that we can wake up as Africans and do what? And go work for ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So on the one hand, what we see across Africa is you have these super old people that are almost ready to be in old age home leading the continent. And the youth with all its vibrancy and potential is excluded from policy making, from leadership and development initiatives. How do we get it right? How do we get these old people? And of course, one understands, you know, there needs to be skills transfer that these people, you know, have gained over the years with experience and wisdom. So one understands that that needs to happen, but how do we facilitate a process where we have more young people in critical spaces, in leadership spaces, be it policy and legislation making, be it within the key sectors of the economy or even within the education system? How do we make sure that we find the right balance? I'm going to be adventurous and ask another question as well. If we look at the education system, as it were, we're teaching people how to set up a CV and how to train to be an interview, to go and find a job, other than really looking at how do we advance entrepreneurial skills and innovation and that type of thing. So how do we find a model that helps us as a continent to move away from teaching people to become beggars of jobs and move to a model where our people can find solutions for themselves and be as you pointed out, Farai, the change that they're looking for or the ones they're waiting for. Within the education system, as it were right now, we have the question of advancing access and opening the doors of learning. At the same time, then, of course, we need to look at the positive benefits, Dr. Mwagiru, of internationalization. So you have this interplay of the commodification of education versus seeing education really as a national treasure that helps us. How do we find the balance then of making sure that we don't have the likes of Dr. Aaron Mutsoaledi that says the hospitals are overpopulated because of foreign nationals, or you have Herman Mashaba saying, you know what, the comments relating to Ebola. When we talk about internationalization and the benefits that it have, how do we make sure that we find the right balance between transactional education and transformational education that will actually make a really good impact? So do we open our doors to answer the national question of access in the country and prevent foreign nationals and internationals from coming to our university so that we have more space for South African students, for example? Or do we actually really tap into the potential of internationalization to foster, amongst other things, skills knowledge, skills transfer, getting to learn from and with one another and vicariously know more about each other? Or do we, you know what, continue the way we're continuing right now? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So my question is directed to Farai. Thank you guys for coming out and investing in our intellectual and occupational wellness. My question is, how do we change the views and perceptions amongst the student populations and leaders that when you collaborate with corporate, when you collaborate with the system, quote unquote, how do you change the perception that when one collaborates with those entities, they're viewed as a sellout? Because as we mentioned earlier, we need to sort of find a balance between the wisdom of the old and the willpower of the young to move forward as a country and as a continent. So how can you practically sort of address that and say, okay, this is when you're actually being a sellout to the system, and this is when you're collaborating with it? Thank you.
Hi, and thank you all for coming out and giving us this talk. I really feel sad for people who aren't here. My question is regarding the education system, because I think, like, especially with coming from Nigeria and being in South Africa, it's quite obvious that there's quite a lot of competition in the education system. It's all about who can achieve the most and this and that. And just like you said, we can't compare Africa to other countries. It's very important for us not to compare educational systems to different countries as well. So my question basically is, how do we bridge that gap? Because there is, even in Africa, there are different, we are on equal footing with education. So how do we sort of partner with each other to bridge that gap that we have in our education system in Africa? Thank you.
Excuse me, sorry. Thank you for that nice presentation. My question is on the ranking of universities, where, I'm speaking from a South African point of view, where we are told that if you want to get a job, come to Stellenbosch or go to UCT or go to Wits. What about the historically black good universities, your Fort Hayes, your University of Limpopo's, and all those? Why is it that we still have these rankings, and why is it they're so highly spoken about? My other question, a quick one, is just about an article written by Belinda Boysens. And it's a very infuriating article where she talks about UNISA and how it has went down the drain because UNISA is trying to meet quotas as quotas of women and quotas of black academics. And she goes on to talk about how it went down and how black managers cannot handle black academics. And this is in relation to issues around sexual harassment and all those things. And of course, they do happen in other universities, which are white universities. So my issue is, what is your view on such articles about universities trying to meet quotas, and when they do, they go down the drain? Does that suggest that when black people are chosen based on a quota, which there's nothing wrong with that because we're trying to correct the wrongs of the past, why is it that they're seen as they do not have the skills and that they need to be controlled by a certain minority group? So, thank you.
Thank you. Since we're almost out of time, I recognize one last hand, and then we'll give back to the panelist.
Hello, thank you. I have a number of questions on the sustainable development, but I know we don't have time. I'll ask just one or two. I know one of the goals of the sustainable development is to reduce poverty by 2050. And I want to know if it will be possible to deal with both sustainable development and capitalism. Another question, my second question, is according to the Paris Agreement, almost all nations agreed to replace conventional sources of energy like fossil fuels by 2020, and now just 1 year left. I think it will be impossible. So in the end, I just want to know if we can achieve the sustainable development by 2050.
Cool. Right. Thank you so much for the questions. So I'll just answer a few and then pass on to my colleagues to answer more. But yes, in terms of Jeff, with your question, what I mentioned using the Ethiopia example is how it's so important for us as Africans to chart our own development. And what countries not only like Ethiopia have done well is that they're learning what are other countries doing and how can I ensure that I model my development for myself, but also learning best practice. So you use the example of China and Russia. I'll give you the example of Rwanda. Rwanda is modeled after Singapore, and the reason is because Paul Kagame really admired Lee Kuan Yew and how he moved Singapore up from having really, really terrible growth, in fact, negative economic growth, to now being one of the most successful countries in the world, and also having really, really low levels of inequality. So definitely there is that benefit in terms of how do we ensure that there's a lot more South-South collaboration happening so that as Africans we can chart our own development. To answer the question from Donovan, I think in terms of, the having more young people in critical spaces, interestingly enough, right, the perception, so the average parliamentarian around the world is 63 years old. In Africa, the average parliamentarian is 57 years old. So we're slightly better, but then you've got the oldest president, if I'm not mistaken, he's from Tunisia, and he's about in his 90s. So we definitely do have these gaps, and you're so right that we definitely need to ensure that there's a lot more mentoring and that it happens a lot earlier. It can't just happen after there's critique, like what happened in Nigeria, where after the critique came from young Nigerians who were being told that they're lazy, then the president said, actually, we need a lot more young people in power. So you're absolutely right, but I think that to add to that, it's going to have to take our politicians themselves recognizing that, young people need to be included a lot earlier, and also it'll take less abuse of the term of youth. I mean, the term youth, it depends on where you are. You can be a youth anywhere in the world, So I'll definitely leave the rest of that to my colleague. But in terms of the education models, and you're absolutely right, and a big issue I have with a lot of our models of education is that they teach us how to be good employees. They don't teach us how to be innovators. They don't teach us how to tackle issues that our continent needs. And that's why I really, really look up to Fred Swanica as a mentor, because he always asks, are you studying what you're studying to get a good job, or are you studying what you're studying so that you can contribute to Africa's growth? And I don't think enough of us, of course, when we're 18, none of us ask ourselves that question, but we need to get into the culture of ensuring that we're asking ourselves that question. And I think what the African Leadership Academy and the African Leadership University is doing really well is that they're not teaching their learners how to be generic accountants or doctors. They're teaching their learners how to have those traits and more, and how to contribute to something larger in the African continent. So when you go for interviews, they don't ask you what you want to be, they ask you what impact you want to make. And through the impact you want to make, they then align you to different career options for you, which I think is a really cool model to work with. And also they're launching what's called the African Leadership Accelerator, because not everyone can get into the African Leadership Academy or the African Leadership University. So then they've now started to roll out these accelerators, which are basically incubator hubs stationed in different African countries. So I do suspect that's going to take over Africa really, really soon. And then the last thing I'll answer is that in terms of how do you change the view of being viewed as a sellout? And I smiled when you asked this question because, the amount of times I was called a sellout at Stellenbosch. And then those same people messaged me to apologize years later when they needed jobs. So that's the first thing to notice. But I must say, I think the thing is that what often happens in university spaces is that unless you think like everyone else, you're a sellout. Which is an issue, right? Because even if you've got your own thoughts about how do we tackle an issue, for as long as you're not having the same group thing that everyone else has, then you're exclusionary, you're not down with the revolution. But what it comes down to is, what are your values? And if you're working towards the same values, it's important to understand that there's different ways to get there. And I don't think we often have that in university. I think universities often become high-pressured performance spaces. We want to perform our activism so that people can respect us. Then when we leave university, we're in crisis mode because of some actions that we did, right? And let me give you an example of having the same values, but getting there differently. The project I'm currently on with the youth and HIV, I am an ambassador of that project. I love it so much. I think I spend 90% of my time doing that work. I believe that we should take incremental approaches so that the model works out. My boss wants to just scale it up. He's engaged with so many different corporates. He's like, Farai, we need these numbers. We both have the same goal. but it's about how do we do it effectively and how do we get there. It doesn't mean that I'm selling out to his vision. It just means that we've got different ways of how to get there. And I think that I would encourage you in this space that it will become very easy to want to succumb to groupthink. But I think what has helped me personally in my own growth and in my career was knowing that it's okay for me to think differently because I still have the same value system. It's about how I am aiming to get there, but how I'll get others there. And also fostering collaborative approaches. So to align yourself with people that challenge you, but also people that also share in your vision. I think that's been the best thing ever. But yeah, don't worry about buzzwords, because after a while people call you asking for jobs, and then you're like, but I thought you said.
Okay, thank you. I will start with the second questions that focused around the access in the idea of an educational model that can work to actually improve our education system, or try to. And one of the things that I've realized is that when you have an idea, actually, let me start with your first part about this, where about access to youth in these spaces. And I know when I touched on older leaders, a lot of them are leaders that don't want to leave. That's one of the biggest challenges, is generally when there's a very older leader in place, it's actually they've just been there for a very long time. They were quite younger when they started, but they're not young anymore. And it's about how do we bridge that divide of co-creating the space, because we can learn a lot from our elders, but they can learn a lot from us too. Because this is the idea of we are all adults. We're all individuals. We might be younger adults, but that gives us almost a space of where we can be a bit more flexible in what ideas we may have and what work we might do. So it's about that balance between it. Because I agree, it is hard. And it is going to take everyone to actually come to that decision-making of actually involving people. But what I've noticed, and to touch in on your second question, is how to become involved. Because a lot of the time, it's picking your right partners. And it's not to say that they have to be like a right international partner, but a right partner while you're here and in the spaces that you operate. Because one of the models that I've approached some of the vice rectors and faculty and some of the different centers to work on a holistic undergraduate research ecosystem. So the one pillar will focus on the co-curriculum, with the society to focus on bringing students from different disciplines and different faculties with postgrads as project leaders or undergrads as they're independent researchers. Then there has to be the curriculum. Because I can't change any curriculum, but if you talk to the people that do fiddle with the curriculum, it's about trying to bring them on board. And what I've noticed is that you want evidence, even if it's something new. It's like, it helps to have evidence. It's important, but sometimes you have to think about how can we branch out, because it'll take our lecturers, and it will take them how they engage with us and how they impart learning. Because I know Professor Klute, when he was a lecturer, he had, just a small anecdote, he had, like, in his students, they were told to do independent research, to go out there, do it on the cheap, because labs are expensive. He told them literally, if you put a carton of milk in the fridge and leave another carton out and measure their pH levels, you're doing the exact same thing of what you're doing with petri dishes and ovens and fridges and all of that. And he was phoned at 12 o'clock, midnight, by 2 policemen, and they were asking, there are these 2 people at the mall at Menden Park in Pretoria. They're like, these 2 people who claim to be your students, but they're swabbing everything and like fiddling in the mall, and it's like midnight. So like, can we arrest them, or are they your students? And it took a minute for him to realize that his students were actually looking for the change in bacterial growth in malls, and how in the evening and in the day, and how it just changes over time. And the only time they could do it was at the middle of the night when no one was there. And it's about, I eventually hope that after 3 years, this whole project and an office and the whole system is in place, we will have students in Ekerstad Mall running around and trying to do the exact same things. And it also touches on models of how to take that across the continent, because there's so many opportunities for students to work amongst different partners. And this also touches on the idea of, when it comes to access of international students in our universities, there is being able to collaborate and work with our partners. And I think that's the AAU's mission, because our whole day-to-day has been around the AAU and Agenda 2063's aspirations of what do we actually want out of the continent. So, I mean, if we seem to like Ethiopia today. In 10 years, they managed to add 50 half private, half public institutions of higher education within a decade or two. And their population of students increased by 1.7 million. A lot of them are undergraduate, and this is this idea of taking the model of what we usually reserve to bring it lower and start that development from the ground up. And it's the same thinking we see now in some very privileged and wealthy high schools and primary schools where people are learning how to code and people are learning robotics. And I only matriculated 5 years ago, and I'm like, I don't remember any of this stuff. It's like a whole different world that... And I mean, there are many schools then that don't have access to these resources and access to these things. So it's about how do we then also be creative? Because, I mean, we spend a quarter of our budget a year, or a fifth of our budget a year on basic education. But we have to be creative with that money because what results are we getting for that? So that's a big part of it.
Thank you. I'm just going to briefly respond in general to some of the questions that were raised without going into too much detail. So just to start with sustainable development, one of the colleagues in the forum asked about why we didn't refer too much to Agenda 2063, because it's a very comprehensive document. And we referred in terms of the aspirations for the continent in a general context. But the Sustainable Development Goals have been articulated by the international community for a long time. And we've been on this journey for a long time, trying to get to poverty reduction, education of the girl child, access to capital and social economic investments for communities. So we've set out a long and tall agenda for the periods that are to come. However, we need to locate individuals who can achieve this. And so my contribution is to look at the role of international organizations. And if you locate a university as an international organization, then education will have to shift to the demands of that new context. So while we are from Nigeria and Kenya and Morocco and Italy and Spain, there's a growing unifying aspect, which is that we all have the same concerns. One of those, as rightfully mentioned, is the environment. Soon is going to be access to those portals or those spaces of leadership. And so in terms of the youth dividend accessing policy, it really is happening already. It's just that a language has to be, and a bridge has to be built to that older generation. There is a receptivity to the voice of the youth, but we need young 23-year-olds to be confident that you can be in a selection panel. We need young 25-year-olds not to see themselves as a non-contributing element in a group of 60-year-olds who say, I have the experience. And so you have to create a global mindset. Education can create this global mindset by incorporating internationalization as part of the curriculum. My previous thing was create peace building as part of the curriculum because we've been fighting. We haven't even stopped fighting. So before we transform, we have to say, what are the criteria for us to collaboratively come together without fighting? That's the first step. So create the spaces, and then we can transact. So somebody says, how do we move between transactional, I give, you give, and transformational? But because I'm a trained negotiator and mediator, dialogue is an exchange. I give you a meaning, you determine what the meaning is, you internalize it, then you respond to me. I negotiate that space with you. It's give and take, always. So the nations are giving and taking at a very high level, unfortunately not always at the value of the African continent. And the last point is that once we understand that it is a negotiation, we have to see what are our interests. As we say, okay, it's a negotiating term, but no permanent friends, only permanent interests. I'd like to move beyond that and say we can also be friends. We can also be friends, but we have to determine what our permanent interests and shared interests are. And the last thing I'll say is that in order to develop the skills, knowledge, and transfer that's relevant for you, the young person, all of us as young people, we have to develop trust. That corporate who we feel that we're selling out to, it's quite a ridiculous notion. Once an opportunity is provided to you, take it. Run the gamut. Open the doors for others who will be like, how did you even get there? I did not see it as a possibility for me. So part of my challenge has been telling people, do you not know what the possibilities are for you? Do not limit yourself. There was a lady astronaut, Mae Jemison. She said the only limits to yourself are the limits you place on your imagination. That is the only limit. So if a corporate is not giving you that job because you don't have the experience, circumvent, go to the next obstacle, move around it, go to the next. There's nothing that is not possible. And the last question on rankings in terms of education is, as we build the trust, South Africa is also a country in a post-reconstruction conflict phase. It's 20 years down the line, coming out of a context that has severely limited the ranking of that institution on a level that is, on a parity level, a level that is equal. So currently, there has to be a method of increasing that access, the parity of access, the equality of access for an academic that within a South African context is referenced according to their demographic group. Other countries around the world in a post-reconstructive stage, like Liberia, the US coming up with the Marshall Plan, China, which used a long model to do that, have incorporated changes, policy changes at an institutional level that enable entry for particularly historically marginalized groups. Until, and at such a time, that project has been successfully achieved, that conversation will remain, because the practice and the experience of academic teaching and business practice will open up the discourse for which leadership qualities and skills are conducive to creating the South Africa we want. And so we can be critical. In other countries in the world, like Ethiopia, and in others, academic spaces are actually being shut down. Rwanda's President Kagame does not want any negative compliments or comments coming through Twitter or Facebook or social media. So we're very lucky in this space in South Africa that we can talk, that we can say. Spaces around the world are being limited currently, and so we must celebrate that and move towards. Thank you.
Sorry as well, that just reminded me as well with the idea of a sellout, just to share my own personal experience of working with corporate South Africa and entities, is that I'm a project developer for Academics for Development, and one thing I've learned over the last few months is that when you engage with people, and let's say, for example, you have an idea, or you are funding, or be it business plans, or working through these things, a lot of people that have been left out are the actual people that these businesses or these entities will be in. Because, for example, our AFD's main drive is to build sustainable businesses that have social impact. But one thing that's been happening a lot in the past is to come up with an idea, find an entrepreneur, get some money from a project partner, and just plop it somewhere and hope for the best. And then after, just check in for a while. But one thing that has changed a lot of perceptions is to actually involve all the stakeholders, the community that you're working in, the people around you, wherever you are, and actually bring those people together to actually engage and talk about how can we start a business that can be sustainable, but also really has a big social impact. Those are the sorts of things that end up bringing people together where they can have a conversation and actually engage on the best way to do something that everyone could win. And that's just what I've noticed that has led to maybe a bit of a more change in how people view corporate South Africa or communities or just random students who come knocking to try and get an idea to go. So, yeah.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you to Nyambura, to Eduard and Farai, and thank you to you for your questions and comments to the panel. Without wasting any further time, I would like to invite Mr. Nico Elema from the Center for Collaborations in Africa to give the closing remarks and a vote of thanks. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. So we have another 30 minutes left in our program, which I will use to my best. Not really. We're actually over our time, so let me just quickly wrap up. And if you can just spare me a few moments to make a few comments and just to thank our speakers. My job at the university is to manage the Center for Collaboration in Africa. And I've been extremely fortunate in my life to travel across the continent. I quickly counted, and out of the 50-odd countries in Africa, I've been to 21 of them. And as I sat and I made a few notes and comments, I realized that a lot that we were speaking of and a lot of the comments I've really experienced on the continent with our other African countries. So just spare me that I'll just run through a few words that I've picked up, and I hope it can maybe just capture some of the contributions we've had. partnership, resilience, education, learning, skills, competencies, youth capital, learning by doing, leadership, sustainable development, short-term goals, long-term goals, focusing on undergraduates, entrepreneur where you are, apply what you learn, change, contribute. What on earth are you doing here? I like that one. Prosperity, own development, youth central. So I think these are words that we can grasp, words that we can hang on to during this day and as we move forward. So just give me the opportunity to thank everybody. You know, there's normally a protocol where we start with our speakers, but I want to start with the attendees. You know, everybody that's sitting here today, you made time to come here, to listen, to contribute, you know, most importantly. And I really want to thank each and every one for attending and making time to be here. Also to Heidi, thank you very much for directing the program and doing a good job on that as well. Also to Nyambura Mwagiru. I know you so well and I'm falling over my own tongue. Thank you very much for your contribution. I know that you're from Kenya, so I can say Asante Sana. And also Eduard. Eduard is our intern in the office, and we really own him. He's really doing a good job wherever he goes, and it's really inspirational to work with him in the office as well. So Edith Beckman, thank you very much for your contributions as well. Farai, thank you very much for your contributions. I haven't known you before, but you know, I think listening to the passion and the comments and the feedbacks that you've made really inspires me as well through the day. Mohini, thank you very much for your the questions and answers and facilitating that as well. So just to conclude, we have a few people also in the office that I just want to thank. Norma, Amanda and Refilwe, thank you everybody for making a success for this day. So if I can just come back to our topic. The topic is the Africa we want and the role of young people. You know, when I take these little keywords that I mentioned earlier, it really speaks to me that it's up to us. There's a call for action. You know, the Africa we want. It's not listening to other people, what they are saying about the Africa that we want. It's the Africa that we want, and it calls us to some kind of action that we can move forward. And yes, it's the role of young people, but it's also for the people that are young at heart, people like me, and to move forward. So it's lunchtime now. I really invite you to have some lunch, and thank you very much.